Imagine living in the city of Rome during the Middle Ages, or maybe during the Renaissance. You're living in a city with massive ruins, with impressive structures that no longer function. The city you live in can't help but be a pitiful version of its former glory. You're reminded every day as you go for a walk, as you go about your business, of what this place once was, but no longer is. The glory of imperial Rome, now a shell. This is long before Rome was a center of tourists where people came to see these ancient wonders. They were just there. How depressing that must be. How disheartening it must be to live in what amounts to a tomb, a mausoleum, a memorial to an era that is not coming back. Well, that thought will help us understand our text this morning from the prophet Haggai, beginning in the second chapter. And I wanted to make a note about the picture that I put up here, because the left at one is the Wailing Wall, traditional site of pilgrimage for Jews to speak to God about the past and about their hopes for the future. The right picture is the Temple Mount, and in the middle of it is the Dome of the Rock, the Muslim mosque. But the size of that compared to the vast footprint of the Temple Mount, I think, speaks to the same idea that we're going to deal with here as they try to rebuild the temple after Solomon's temple had been destroyed. So that picture should help us understand what they were thinking hundreds of years previously. So beginning in chapter 2, at the start of the chapter, it says, "On the 21st day of the 7th month, the word of the Lord came through the prophet Haggai, speak to Zerubbabel, son of Shealtiel, governor of Judah, to Joshua, son of Jehozadak, the high priest, and to the remnant of the people. Ask them, who of you is left who saw this house in its former glory? How does it look to you now? Does it not seem to you like nothing?" Well, let's back that up. So the 21st day is October 17th. The year is 520 BC. This is actually the the last day of the Festival of Tabernacles. This is a time to celebrate the summer harvest, a time to give God praise for blessings. So this is an odd message to come at that time. We are less than a month after our previous week's message where they were told, get back to work, right? The temple has been waiting for 16 years for you to finish rebuilding it. It's been less than a month since then. And this is the 7th month. The 7th month is called Tishri. It contains the Feast of Trumpets. That's the first day of the month. The Day of Atonement on the 10th day. And the Feast of Tabernacles from the 15th to the 21st, plus the Sabbaths. So they're not getting much work done between when Haggai said, get to work, and they started again, and this day. Because most of those days, all of those days that I mentioned, you can't work. You're not supposed to work. And plus, this is the height of the harvest. So the farmers are getting the harvest in. So I don't know if they got much of anything done, but here God sends them a second message, and it focuses on this. Who is left that remembers what this place used to be? That was 586 BC when the Babylonians destroyed Solomon's temple, burned it to the ground, ransacked it, ruined it. It was 66 years before this. So how many people do you think were there that remembered 66 years ago? Old enough then to have remembered it, to remember what it used to be. And of course, they survived the sacking of the city. They lived those 66 years and can come back and think about it. It's not very many people, but there must have been a few. who remember what the Temple of Solomon had looked like in all of its glory. It was a wonder of the ancient world. It was massive. It was full of precious gems and stones. It was amazing, that temple. How does it look to you now? Well, now it's just a blank foundation. Whatever little bit of work they've gotten done. But you have to know that when they started to rebuild, they were not building on the same scale. They were not building with the same materials. They were not building to replicate what Solomon had built, because it's not going to happen. 16 years ago, we're told that when they first started the project, before they put it aside, the older people that could remember Solomon's temple, when they saw the plans laid out for the new temple, they wept. Because they said, this will be nothing. This will be nothing compared to what we remember. It will be a pathetic second temple in comparison. It's not just nostalgia. It's not just what we do when we get old, right? And say, back when I was a kid, things were better. It's not that. It's that they really were better when these people were young. The present temple, the job that they've just been given by God to rebuild this temple, is never going to be what it was. It cannot be what it once was. Now, before we think about this in terms of the Gospels when they're in the temple, that's not the same temple as this. The temple that Jesus walked in is the refurbished and enlarged and made much better temple by Herod when he started working on it in 20 BC. So this is not going to be a magnificent temple. So why is God asking them? Why is God reminding them that the work they're doing now is not going to compare to what was done a few generations ago? This is a remnant of the people, right? They are not a prosperous nation. They do not have the resources of a whole wealthy kingdom at their disposal to rebuild this temple. It's impossible for them to match the achievement of their ancestors. Why is God bringing that up? That seems a little bit harsh, doesn't it? They already know that it's not going to be Solomon's temple reborn. They already know that it's going to be a sad version of it. Why is God bringing it up? Step back from the text for a minute. I want to show you something else. This, and it's in pieces, so I got to be careful. This is the Sunday school attendance book for this church from 1907. Got it out of this display case. 1907, December 22nd, 1907, Sunday school total, 1,014 people. December 29th, 841 people. January 5th, 1,030 people. Those were the best numbers for 1907. The rest of the year is 500, 600, 700, sad numbers. But at Christmas time, more than 1,000 people. 112 years ago. Those numbers here, in this place, in this exact building, our circumstances are not exactly the same as Israel. We are not trying to rebuild the building that our previous generations were in. We're trying to rebuild the church that they had, the congregation they had, the impact that they had. And when we compare us to them, do we not feel the same way that Israel did, standing on the Temple Mount, looking at what was being laid out and saying, this isn't going to work? Us versus them. Well, when this book was being written in this town, this county was in a massive oil boom, was it not? There were people everywhere. There was wealth in many places. There were more than 1,000 people in this church on a regular basis. What is our comparison? In the 70s, Pennzoil and Quaker State left, did they not? Taking the rest of that oil industry with them. The population of this county has declined steadily year after year after year. We're not, as a county, as a town, as a community, what we once were in many ways. There were 1,000 people here on a Sunday. We're happy when we break 100 on Easter and Christmas Eve, right? We're not what they were. We can't be what they were. We need to sit with that for a minute. We need to ponder that. We need to understand that. So what do we do about it? Do we weep? Do we mourn? Do we blame? Do we get frustrated? What do we do with that truth? That we're not what they were. And we don't have to go all the way back 100 years for that comparison. If you back up in living memory, talked to Bill Moffat about this some time ago. Back when he was preparing to be a deacon, you couldn't get on the board without being a junior deacon. How many men were on the board? 20? About 20. And each of them had a junior deacon learning from him, prepared to take his spot when the time came. Is that the way our boards are right now? So many people want the spots that we have to have assistants, understudies, so that someday they'll get a chance. Probably not, right? Most of you are on the board. You understand exactly what I'm talking about. So we're not what even living memory once had. What do we do? How do we react? How do we respond to that hard truth? See, I did the same thing that the prophet did there, right? I pointed it out to you. I reminded you of it. We could pretend and forget it and not think about it, or we can face it and figure out what to do about it. Let's see what the prophet had for the people of Israel, because the message is the same for us as you could have guessed. Verse 4, "But now be strong, Zerubbabel, declares the Lord. Be strong, Joshua, son of Jehozadak, the high priest. Be strong, all you people of the land, declares the Lord, and work. For I am with you, declares the Lord Almighty. This is what I covenanted with you when you came out of Egypt, and my spirit remains among you. Do not fear." Why did God bring it up? Why did God tell them, oh, by the way, don't forget what you're doing now is a shell of what your ancestors did? Because he wants them to face it. He doesn't want to pretend. He wants them to recognize the truth and tells them 3 times, be strong. Tells the leaders to be strong, tells the people to be strong. God is not in the business of telling us that everything is going to be okay when it's not okay. God is not in the business of making us feel better when things are bad. God wants us to see the truth, to face the truth. Notice that he calls them all you people of the land. In the last chapter, he said these people are not doing what they're supposed to be. Now that they have begun to work and listened to his prophet, he says, my people of the land, the people that came here, who are here because God gave this land to Abraham. He reminds them of the covenant. The task is indeed daunting that they faced, and they were not going to build the same temple of Solomon. They were not going to recreate the former glory. But notice what God tells them. Work. So what? Get to work. Do what you can do. I don't care, is what God is saying. I don't care that it's not going to be as pretty as what your ancestors worshiped in. Get to work, for I am with you. And that makes all the difference in the world. If God is with them, then that's what matters. It does not matter that they will not rebuild the former glory if God is with them. God has called them to rebuild. He sent his prophets to them. He wants this to happen. He's going to be with them. And he reminds them, after telling them to be strong, after telling them to get to work, he reminds them, we have a covenant. I made a promise to Abraham. I made a promise to Moses. I made a promise to David. And those promises cannot be undone. So no matter what is going on now, we have a covenant. He reminds them of when they came up out of Egypt as a people. When they came up out of Egypt, they had nothing but what they were carrying with them. They did not have the land yet. They did not have a temple yet. They didn't have a country yet. They were a wandering group of people in the wilderness that God had brought up out of slavery. And God took that people, a people that did not have the law yet until he gave it to them, a people that had a lot of issues, and he molded them and shaped them with leaders like Joshua and Samuel, and built them into the people that built Solomon's temple. So he reminds them, when I brought you up out of Egypt with my power, I brought you to this land, I built you into a nation. The power that God used and had available then is still available. Just because they are not a mighty nation anymore does not mean that God's power has waned at all. And he ends the thought with saying, my spirit remains among you, do not fear. The glory of God had dwelt between the cherubim in the most holy place of Solomon's temple. The visible glory of God had been there with them. And that visible glory is not with them right now. There is no temple. They don't have that assurance. They don't have that as a mark of saying that we are God's people. His glory is in that temple. But God's Spirit remains with them. You can't see it, but it's still with them. So they have no reason to fear. The Apostle Paul will later write, if God is for us, who can be against us? That's the same thought here. Do not fear the future. Do not fear that what a less glorious temple will be, because it will not hinder the Spirit of God. It will not hinder the will of God. God will accomplish his will through his people no matter what he's got to work with, because the power of God is what's getting it done. So let's step back again and think about ourselves and where we stand. What do we have to work with? Is the Spirit of God still among us as it was with our ancestors in the faith here in this church? Is God still for us? Can God still do great things for us and through us and in us? Or has that day passed? Have you thought about that? That's the kind of thing that would keep me up at night. That's the kind of thing that I think about on a regular basis. Where is this church going? What are we doing now? What will our future be? We have things coming. We're only a couple of weeks away from the Palm Sunday service, the county-wide ecumenical Palm Sunday service, where more than 100 people, maybe almost 200 people this year, will be there worshiping together. And then that next Friday, the crosswalk will go right through here, and we'll have, unless it's sub-zero again like it was last year, we'll have more than 200 people. And then that evening, we'll have the Good Friday service. It's here this year. And we'll have people from churches all over Franklin coming. The Spirit of God is absolutely still in this community, still working through the churches of this community. The Spirit among us is the key. It does not matter if we are working with 5 or 10 or 20, however many people we have that are committed to prayer, that are zealous for their friends and neighbors to come to the Lord and be saved. If that is what we have to work with, God will do things through us that are amazing. We don't need 1,000 people to leave an imprint in this community for the cause of Jesus Christ. We need a few to start with who are committed to what God is trying to do through us. Verse 6, this is what the Lord Almighty says, in a little while I will once more shake the heavens and the earth, the sea and the dry land. I'll shake all nations, and what is desired by all nations will come, and I will fill this house with glory, says the Lord Almighty. Given their melancholy at contemplating Solomon's temple compared to their own effort, God chooses to encourage his people with the big picture. He says, step back from your day and think about what is to come. And they're not going to live to see this. This is not a promise for them to live to see. This is something to assure their faith, for them to hold on to through the dark days and say that God will certainly someday do this because he's promised, and we can trust that. And he says, I'll shake the heavens and the earth, I'll shake the nations. I don't know if that's literal or metaphorical or something in between, but it's definitely a day of reckoning that will come. And when that day comes, he says, what is desired by all nations will fill this house with glory. Now, this is either a prophetic reference to the Messiah, because he is definitely the desire of all nations, the one that filled the house of God with glory, or it's a more literal reference to the future temple being a glorious place, a place that will outshine Solomon's temple with its splendor and grandeur. But God has promised his people that he will fill his house with glory. It's not up to them. It wasn't up to what they would be able to do in their day, because God had a plan and the power to bring it to fruition. And he says this, the silver is mine, the gold is mine, declares the Lord Almighty. The glory of this present house will be greater than the glory of the former house, says the Lord Almighty. And in this place I will grant peace, declares the Lord Almighty. I'm not sure about the silver is mine, the gold is mine. That may be a reference to the material glory of the future temple. That would make sense there. He says, the glory of this present house will be greater than the glory of the former house. The temple that they are working on now will have more glory in it than the temple of Solomon. Now that's a head scratcher, because he just told them, look at this place. Does this place look as nice as what you remember? And then he ends by saying, this place, which will not be as glorious as the last place, will have more glory in it, though. How can that be? It's not going to be as impressive architecturally or artistically. How will the temple that they are building contain within it more glory? Very simple reason. That is the temple in which one day the Son of God will sit and teach. It's the temple which Jesus will drive the money changers out of. It is the temple where the Son of God, Emmanuel, God in the flesh, will dwell with his people. Remember the former temple, the temple of Solomon. The glory of God dwelt within the Holy of Holies, but the only person that ever saw that was the high priest on the Day of Atonement. Nobody else ever saw that. They couldn't go in there. They were separated from God, because if they went in there, they would have been struck dead. And yet this temple, this more modest temple that they are building, 500 years from now, the Son of God will walk among his people in the flesh, healing the lame and the blind. And instead of a separation between God and his people, Jesus Christ will reach out and touch the leper. Jesus will put his hands on the eyes of the blind man and heal him. Jesus will be with his people, and that glory will far outshine anything that ever happened in Solomon's day, because God will be there in the flesh. As you think about the glory of the former house, don't forget the history of the people of Israel. Solomon built that amazing temple, but the next generation divided the kingdom in two, did they not? A northern kingdom and a southern kingdom. And one generation after Solomon built that glorious temple, a large number of the people were no longer worshiping there, because they were worshiping up in the north at Mount Gerizim. They were not worshiping in Solomon's temple. So while the building was magnificent, the people, a generation, 2 generations after, were divided. And as you read the history of the people of Israel, that was the time of their trials, when the prophets were coming and saying, return to the Lord before it's too late. The temple was glorious, but the people were walking away from God. In this place, God says, I will grant peace. The holy mountain, Zion, the city of David, the epicenter of the work of God amongst humanity. There certainly is not yet peace in Palestine. There rarely has been peace in Palestine, in Israel, in Canaan, whatever you want to call it. There has not been much peace there. But the peace of God will one day be centered there when Jesus Christ returns to rule from Jerusalem and establish his kingdom, fulfilling the covenant with Abraham, the covenant with David, and keeping God's word. And that glory will be beyond the wildest dreams of any of the people sitting there listening to Haggai. Last little bit of our text. We're skipping to verse 20. I don't normally do this, but the verses in between are a whole separate topic. Verses 20 through the end here, very much related to what we just read. So let's end with this. The word of the Lord came to Haggai a second time on the 24th day of the month. Tell Zerubbabel, governor of Judah, that I'm going to shake the heavens and the earth. I will overturn royal thrones and shatter the power of the foreign kingdoms. I will overthrow chariots and their drivers, horses and their riders will fall, each by the sword of his brother. This is December 18th. It's 2 months later. This is a message for the governor, not the people in general, but very similar to what he told the people, right? I will shake the earth. I will shake the kingdoms. And what is the message he has for Zerubbabel about that day? On that day, declares the Lord Almighty, I will take you, my servant Zerubbabel, son of Shealtiel, declares the Lord, and I will make you like my signet ring, for I have chosen you, declares the Lord Almighty. The prophet Haggai ends his ministry. We're going to look at that little bit that we skipped next week. He ends it by reminding the leader of the people that God was still with him. Zerubbabel is a descendant of David. He is in the line of the Messiah between David and Jesus Christ. And so God is still with him and will use him and will continue to work through David's descendants until that day when the Messiah comes. For I have chosen you, he says. This whole story is a story of the choice of God. God saying, Abraham, come here. God calling Moses and saying, go get my people. God saying, Samuel, go find David. God making the choice and sending his people and working through them, and he has continued to do it. He's telling Zerubbabel, I have not changed the way that I work. I will still choose and call. And that hasn't changed to this day. God still works that way. 3 things I think we need to remind ourselves of and think about as we ponder this passage. This is the only generation that we are responsible for. You know that, right? We are not responsible for what our ancestors did, both good or ill, what their glory or their failures. That's not us. And we are not responsible for what will happen here when we're dead and gone. We are responsible for this generation and what we can do here and now. Secondly, rest assured that God will be glorified in each and every generation. We may not have the 1,000 people that this church had 115 years ago, but God will indeed be glorified in this generation of this church through us. Lastly, the prophet ends by promising peace, by saying, I will make peace. And that is what we hold to this day. God is the one that has promised true peace to his people. God is the one that will provide it. And we are the chosen people of God, the people that God has called by name out of the darkness into the light, that we might have and find peace and share that with others.